And not up around the North Pole, because it's getting crowded up there now, because they find out it's really usable, not only to live in, but militarily.
Ticker tape, Congressional medals, unshakable hero status. America gave Richard Byrd everything for being the first man to fly over the North Pole. But they didn't know about the notebook locked away in a dusty box. For 7 decades, one small diary held its breath, because if the world ever read it, a national hero would become a national fraud. The notebook that wasn't supposed to surface. Here's where this gets genuinely interesting. When Byrd died, his personal papers went to Ohio State University, where they became part of a massive archive. Correspondence, photographs, expedition logs, decades of an extremely public life, boxed up and cataloged piece by piece. And sitting inside that collection, completely unnoticed for decades, was a small, weathered brown notebook, about 8 by 9 inches. This wasn't just some old journal. This was the actual diary Byrd carried with him in the cockpit on the Josephine Ford during the flight itself. Because the engine noise in that plane cabin was so deafening, Byrd and Bennett physically couldn't talk to each other in the air, so they wrote notes back and forth in this exact notebook to communicate. It also contains Byrd's live navigational calculations scribbled down mid-flight. This is quite literally the closest thing that exists to a real-time transcript of what actually happened up there. An Ohio State archivist named Raymond Goerler finally found it in 1996 while cataloging a box that had reportedly been assumed to hold nothing but artifacts. Exactly 70 years, almost to the very day, after the flight it documented. For archivists, discoveries like this almost never happen. Most collections have been cataloged, cross-referenced, and examined countless times over the decades, yet somehow the single item that could shed the most light on one of aviation's biggest controversies had escaped serious public attention. It wasn't hidden inside a secret government vault or buried beneath layers of classified files. It had simply sat quietly among thousands of ordinary historical documents, waiting for someone to realize what it actually was. That almost makes the story stranger. If Goerler hadn't opened that particular box when he did, the notebook might have remained overlooked for many more years, and the debate over Byrd's North Pole flight would have continued without the one first-hand document everyone had been wishing for. Historians suddenly found themselves in the rare position of being able to compare Byrd's polished public account with notes written in the heat of the moment, before there was time to shape a narrative or defend a reputation. That's what made the notebook so valuable. It wasn't just another memoir written years later with fading memories. It captured split-second decisions, rough calculations, and hurried observations recorded while the aircraft was still flying through the Arctic sky. And here's a detail that makes this feel even less like an accident, and more like an actual cover story cracking open. Ohio State University Press had initially been approached about publishing the diary back in April of 1996 and reportedly declined, given just how sensitive and controversial the material inside clearly was. Why does any of this matter so much? Because when researchers finally got their hands on the one physical document that could reveal what really happened in that cockpit, what they found inside was not the clean confirmation anybody expected. What the erasures actually show. So the diary goes public. The story runs in newspapers and on television and radio, across the United States, Europe, and as far away as Australia. Columnist George Will reportedly ranked it as one of the biggest stories of the entire year. Ohio State eventually published it properly in 1998 as To the Pole, the diary and notebook of Richard E. Byrd, and it later became the basis for a PBS American Experience documentary called Alone on the Ice. And once historians and scientists actually got to study the pages themselves, they noticed something. There are legible erasures inside the navigational calculations, spots where Byrd had written a sextant sighting down, rubbed it out, and written something different in its place. According to reporting at the time, those erased calculations appeared to sharply contradict the official typewritten report Byrd later submitted to the National Geographic Society just weeks after the flight. The Washington Post, marking exactly 70 years to the day since the flight, reported that the new evidence suggested Byrd may have actually turned back roughly 2 hours and about 150 miles short of the pole itself. And at one point in the diary, Byrd apparently wrote a note to Bennett that read something like, "We should be at the North Pole now. Make a circle," which skeptics point to as exactly the kind of moment you'd expect if the plan was to fake reaching the destination rather than actually get there. Naturally, this set off a real academic fight, and it is honestly one that is still going on today. One camp, led by a researcher named Dennis Rollins, examined the erasures and the surrounding sextant math in serious depth and published his conclusions in the scientific journal Polar Record, arguing pretty bluntly that the evidence shows Byrd and Bennett made a genuinely heroic attempt but never actually reached the pole, and that the record afterward was altered to make it look like they had. The other camp pushed back hard. A researcher named Joseph Portney published a piece called The Polar Flap, Byrd's Flight Confirmed, directly disputing Rollins's math. And Ohio State astronomer Gerald Newsom argued that the erasures could just as easily be Byrd catching his own mid-flight calculation errors, exhausted and under enormous pressure, rather than proof of an intentional cover story. Newsom's later published research pointed out that without Byrd's complete original navigation log, which has never actually been recovered, it is genuinely difficult to prove fraud with full scientific certainty either way. So even with the diary sitting right there in researchers' hands, even with the erasures visible in black and white, the actual experts still don't fully agree on what it proves. What basically everyone does agree on is this: the diary shows Byrd genuinely believed at the moment he wrote in it that he had reached the pole. Whether that belief actually matched reality is the part that's still being argued in academic journals nearly 100 years later. Kind of wild, right? 70 years of total silence, and the one document that finally spoke up still couldn't give a fully clean answer. And it's not like this argument stayed confined to one paper and one rebuttal either. Rollins actually published two separate versions of his case, one in the peer-reviewed journal Polar Record out of Cambridge, and a longer, even more detailed breakdown in a journal called DIO, walking page by page through Byrd's sextant sightings and timestamps. Portney's rebuttal went equally deep from the opposite direction, trying to reconstruct exactly what a 1920s sun sighting under those specific ice and light conditions could and couldn't tell you with certainty. Two serious researchers, two completely different professional backgrounds, staring at the exact same handful of erased pencil marks and landing in entirely different places. That's not the profile of a settled historical fact. That's the profile of a genuine, live, unresolved dispute. The golden boy of American aviation. So let's set the scene. It's the 1920s, and America is completely obsessed with firsts. First to cross the Atlantic solo, first to summit this, first to reach that. And into that obsession walks Richard Evelyn Byrd, a Navy officer from a seriously connected Virginia family. His dad was a prosecuting attorney and Speaker of the Virginia House. His own brother, Harry, would go on to become governor of Virginia and then a United States senator. This was not a random guy off the street. This was old money, old politics, and a family that knew exactly how to build a public image. Byrd had already helped plan the navigation for the first successful transatlantic flight, so by the mid-1920s he was already circling in some pretty elite aviation company. But he wanted more than helped plan. He wanted his own first, something with his name directly attached, forever. So he set his sights on flying a plane straight over the North Pole and back, something nobody had ever done and lived to prove. He teamed up with a pilot named Floyd Bennett, got himself a 3-engine Fokker plane called the Josephine Ford, and on May 9, 1926, the two of them took off from Spitsbergen, Norway, heading due north into nothing but ice, fog, and empty sky. 16 hours later, they landed right back where they started, and Byrd announced to the world that he had done it. First man ever to fly over the top of the planet. National Geographic backed him. The Navy backed him. He got a ticker tape parade, a promotion, and the Medal of Honor, which for context is the highest award for heroism the United States government hands out. This wasn't a quiet little accomplishment tucked into a science journal. This was global, front page, legend-making stuff, and a full year later he'd go on to become the third person ever to complete a transatlantic flight, right behind Charles Lindbergh. But here's the question a handful of very sharp, very annoyed people kept asking in private: how exactly do you prove you flew directly over an invisible point in the middle of a completely featureless ice sheet using 1920s instruments, with literally nobody else around to confirm it? The people who didn't buy it, Almost immediately, aviation people who actually understood distance, speed, and fuel started running the numbers, and the numbers were not landing clean. The math is pretty simple, in theory. The round-trip distance from Spitsbergen to the pole and back is known. The cruising speed of the Josephine Ford is known. And when you plug Byrd's claimed 16-hour flight time into that equation, some researchers kept landing on the same uncomfortable conclusion. There wasn't enough time, and possibly not enough fuel, to have actually reached the pole and made it back, unless the plane caught a serious tailwind that the historical weather records for that day just don't support. Byrd's own explanation was favorable winds. Some contemporaries accepted that at face value. Others very much did not, including people who'd flown with him. One of the loudest skeptics turned out to be Bernt Balchen, a Norwegian-American aviator who had actually assisted Byrd's own expedition team. In 1958, Balchen went public casting doubt on the flight, based on his own detailed personal knowledge of exactly how fast that plane could realistically go. By 1971, Balchen was going even further, suggesting Byrd may have simply circled out near the horizon, out of sight of land, killed enough time to make the math look right, and then flown home and claimed the pole. And in 1973, one author reported something even spicier, that Byrd's own pilot, Floyd Bennett, had privately confessed to Balchen that the two of them had done exactly that. Now, Bennett couldn't confirm or deny any of this by that point, because he'd died back in 1928, just 2 years after the flight, which meant the only other person who actually knew what happened in that cockpit took it to his grave. So for decades, this just became one of those simmering arguments in polar exploration circles. Byrd's defenders pointed to his spotless official record and the National Geographic Society's endorsement. His skeptics pointed to the physics and to people like Balchen, who actually knew the plane. And without hard physical evidence either way, it mostly stayed exactly that, a rumor argued by very credentialed people going absolutely nowhere. Byrd himself never really addressed any of it publicly in detail. He just kept moving. He kept expeditioning, kept being Admiral Byrd, the legend, and went on to lead 5 separate expeditions to Antarctica, including Operation High Jump in 1946 and 47, which really was the largest Antarctic operation in history at the time, with thousands of personnel, dozens of aircraft, and a full fleet of ships mapping well over 1,000 miles of coastline. He kept building the myth right up until his death in 1957. Operation High Jump itself actually ended up wrapping earlier than originally planned, and while Byrd was officially named the officer in charge, historians who've gone through the record note that actual day-to-day command mostly flowed through younger Navy officers underneath him, many of them men who'd cut their teeth as his own protégés on earlier trips. By the time he returned to Antarctica one final time in 1955 for Operation Deep Freeze, in his late 60s, initiative in polar science had largely passed out of his hands entirely, and by most accounts he was often sidelined by the very generation of explorers he'd trained. The empire he built was still standing, but he wasn't really the one running it anymore. But the North Pole question just sat there, completely unresolved, for the rest of his life. So what happened to the one piece of physical evidence that could have actually settled all of it, once and for all? Byrd wasn't even the first one people accused. Before we get to the notebook, you actually need one more piece of context, because it makes Byrd's situation so much messier. The North Pole had already burned 2 other reputations before Byrd ever got in that plane. Back in 1909, an explorer named Frederick Cook announced he'd reached the pole on foot. Just a few weeks later, a rival explorer named Robert Peary announced he'd done the same thing, and immediately started publicly trashing Cook's claim to protect his own. Eventually, the National Geographic Society, the same organization that would later back Byrd, threw its support behind Peary, but historians have spent more than a century picking apart both claims, and there's a pretty strong case that neither man actually reached the exact pole, that both were likely off by a significant distance, and that Cook in particular had a documented history of exaggerated claims from earlier expeditions. So by the time Byrd took off in 1926, the North Pole already had a reputation as basically the most disputed piece of geography on the planet, a place where, verified by a committee, didn't always mean actually happened. Byrd knew that history. He knew exactly what kind of scrutiny a North Pole claim would eventually attract, and he went for it anyway, with the same National Geographic Society doing the verifying. Kind of makes you wonder if he was supremely confident or just betting that nobody would ever be able to prove otherwise. Either way, that's the environment his diary went quiet in for the next 70 years. Why this one refuses to die. Here's the thing about this particular story that keeps historians coming back to it decade after decade. This isn't some random claim floating around with zero receipts. This is Ohio State University's own official archive. This is a peer-reviewed polar science journal out of Cambridge, actually publishing dueling academic papers about it. This is named Researchers on the Record in Both Directions, staking their professional reputations on their reading of one man's handwriting. And Byrd, notably, never resolved any of it himself while he was alive. He never publicly addressed the fuel and speed math that skeptics like Balchin were raising as early as the 1950s. He just kept building the next expedition and the next, letting the legend do the talking for him. Whether that was because he was completely confident he'd actually done it, or because some part of him knew better than to reopen the question, is genuinely something we cannot know for certain. That's not spin, that's simply where the actual verified evidence runs out. What we can say for certain is that a man became a national hero, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a lifelong public legend off the back of a single, unverifiable claim. That the one physical piece of evidence capable of checking that claim sat forgotten in a box for exactly 70 years. And that when it finally surfaced in the hands of trained historians and scientists rather than random internet theorists, it raised just as many questions as it answered. And it's worth sitting with just how big the fallout actually was once the story broke. This wasn't a footnote buried on page 9 somewhere. It ran across newspapers, radio, and television on 3 continents. Sparked a full docudrama treatment, and even prompted people with connections to the original 1926 expedition to start reaching out to Ohio State's archive with their own family photographs and letters, decades after the fact, because suddenly the whole story was relevant again. A legend that had gone quiet for 70 years came roaring right back into the public conversation the moment one notebook resurfaced. So did Richard Byrd actually stand over the top of the world on May 9, 1926, or did he come home a national hero for a flight he never actually finished? Even the man's own handwriting, sitting untouched in an archive box for 7 decades, still can't fully answer that one. And honestly, that's what makes this one hit different from your typical explorer legend. It's not a theory somebody made up for internet clout. It's a real, physically documented, still unresolved fight among actual named historians and scientists, sitting in an actual university archive with actual published journal papers attached to it. If you're into stories where the official version and the paper trail quietly don't line up, subscribe and turn on notifications because we're digging up a new one every single week.